Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That quote has become one of the most famous in all of evolutionary theory, and it comes from an essay that was written by Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was one of the more prominent geneticists of the last century. And what he means by it is that prior to Darwin, prior to the theory of evolution, biology was just a smattering of unconnected observations. That leaf is serrated, and that frog is poisonous, and that marsupial happens to have a pouch, and that cheetah has spots. But with Darwin came a unifying theory that could explain why that leaf is serrated and why that frog is poisonous and why that cheetah has spots. The other thing that Darwin's theory did is it knocked humans off a pedestal that we put ourselves on. It erased the line that separated us, who we used to think were halfway between the angels and the beasts, and the rest of those beasts in the animal kingdom. It showed that we are made of the same stuff and by the same process as the hippopotamus is, and the rat is, and the mushroom is. And yet we are different. No other animal has built a skyscraper, and no other animal that we know of has come up with the theory of evolution to explain its ultimate origins, and no other animal has built a religion. So how did that happen? How did humans come to do so much more? How did they come to build a civilization? Up until a few million years ago, up until about 2 million years ago, there was no indication that our species would be the ones to build skyscrapers and to build a civilization. About 6 million years ago, we'd recently diverged from our closest ancestor with the chimpanzee, and we were just one of a number of different primate species scraping together a life in the African savanna. But then something changed. Our ancestors started walking upright, and that freed our hands to develop tools, our first technology. And that led to our second technology, the harnessing of fire. Now, Darwin recognized that harnessing of fire to be the single most significant human achievement other than language. And cultural mythologies around the world seem to also recognize this moment of our harnessing fire to be a significant change in the human species. So many of you guys will be familiar with the Greek myth of Prometheus. Now, Prometheus stole from Zeus fire and imbued it to our otherwise unremarkable species. Now, in some versions of the myth, it wasn't just fire that Prometheus gave. It was also agriculture and writing and science and mathematics. In short, it was culture. It was culture that was brought along with fire. And from a scientific perspective, it turns out that the harnessing of fire may have had a lot to do with that development of culture. You see, no one is born able to build a fire. It's not something that comes as part of an innate, pre-wired aspect of our human psychology. It's something you have to learn, a skill that got passed down culturally rather than genetically. In addition to giving us warmth and protection, fire actually radically changed our digestive systems. So I'll give you an example. A chimpanzee, just like a human, tends to really like meat. But they need to spend hours, literally hours, chewing the meat before they can swallow it. But what fire enabled humans to do is to tenderize the meat, essentially pre-digesting it by doing what we call cooking. This freed up hours and calories, and it actually radically changed the environment that we were adapted to. Now our bodies bear evidence of that evolutionary change. We have smaller teeth and we have smaller digestive systems, and most importantly, because of the metabolic energy that our digestive system conserves, plus the extra metabolic energy that the meat provides, we have bigger brains. So the cultural innovation of fire allowed for a bigger brain, and that bigger brain allowed for more sophisticated cultural innovations, like language and ultimately agriculture. And in that sense, culture became autocatalytic. It produced its own fuel to feed off of. Now, what that means is that unlike almost every other animal on the planet, we didn't have to start afresh every generation, solely outfitted with our genetic endowment. Instead, we had two endowments. We had the genetic endowment that we inherited from our parents, but we also had a cultural endowment, a cultural legacy that we took down from the previous generation. So humans are born into the world with dual inheritances. We're born with our genetic legacy of biological adaptations that helps us fit our environment. But we're also born with a cultural legacy that's been built piecemeal over generations to help us thrive in our environment even better. And that idea is called dual inheritance theory. And so increasing from about 2 million years ago, the benefits of culture, be it in the form of social organization or hunting methods or technologies or religions, became the main driver of our genetic evolution. We developed a host of genetic adaptations to make us a better cultural species. We developed adaptations to make us more socially adept, to understand the minds of others, to learn and imitate others, and to better store and manipulate cultural information. According to the cultural brain hypothesis, the massive brain growth that we've experienced over the last 2 million years has been driven by evolutionary pressures for us to be better social learners. Those among us best able to learn that information that came down from their elders and to manipulate that information and pass it on, those were the ones who are most likely to reproduce and survive in our species. And as a result, we bear the legacy of that process of evolution, selecting for better learners each subsequent generation. That made our species so reliant on culture that for at least the last 100,000 years, we are a necessarily cultural species. Were we outfitted simply with our genetic inheritances and got no cultural information, we would have a very difficult time surviving in the environments that we currently live. So we talked about whether Tarzan would believe in God. The problem comes well before that. Tarzan would not even be able to live with the apes like he did. He would have been under-muscled and under-furred, and he would have had a digestive system that was too small to digest what the other apes were eating, and he would have no one to teach him how to cook to get the food that his body now needed. Our bodies are now born with the expectation of culture. So the process by which cultural innovations led to genetic changes is what's called gene-culture coevolution. So one example of that is how the cultural innovation of fire led to all these genetic changes in our bodies. Another example is how the domestication of milk-producing animals and our drinking their milk led to lactose tolerance for some portion of people on Earth. And it also happened psychologically. We developed mental adaptations that allowed us to better absorb all the increasingly valuable cultural information around us. Among those was the ability to now simulate what others were thinking, something that we previously called theory of mind. It also allowed us to identify that whatever our surrounding group is doing is good, something called the conformity bias. And it also allowed us to pay attention to those people within the group who appear to be the most successful, appear to be the ones that everyone else is paying attention to. That's called prestige bias. Now, while the cultural innovation of tools and fire and later language and agriculture were more or less species-wide events, different groups also formed their own types of cultural innovations, their own specific adaptations to their local environment. So they've developed their own types of technology, for instance, bows and arrows or kayaks, and they developed their own hunting techniques, and they developed their own forms of social organization, and they developed their own social norms to regulate how people act around each other. So the fact that some of those innovations helped specific groups be more successful set the stage for the next important concept, which is cultural group selection. And here's where religion finally enters the picture. Intergroup competition has been a hallmark of our history. We have a very long and bloody history of violence in our species. But interestingly, that history of violence has also been the crucible in which we've produced one of our greatest achievements in cooperation. Here's how. Things like the conformity bias lead people to adopt whatever is the local norm around them. And that leads those types of norms to stabilize within a group. If it's the case that most people within a group are self-interested, then everybody will start adopting that self-interested norm and it will become a self-interested group. If the norm happens to be egalitarianism, then people will look around and they'll see everybody else is egalitarian and they'll start becoming egalitarian themselves, and then eventually you'll have a full group of pretty much all egalitarian people. If everybody's monogamous, well, then the same thing happens. So this leads to various different groups having different norms or different cultures. Now the thing is, when those different groups compete with each other, it's those particular groups whose norms make them stronger as a group that tend to survive and triumph over the other groups whose norms don't make them as strong as a group. So think about it this way. On a soccer team, you can have individual players who are individually very good, But if they don't work together using strategies that make them good as a team, then they're going to be outcompeted. They're going to be beaten by other teams which do work better as groups. And if they do stumble on a strategy which makes them work really well as a team, then you'll often see that strategy spread throughout the different teams in the league, eventually becoming the league-wide norm. So this is essentially how cultural group selection works, or at least one form of it. Intergroup competition leads those cultures which support the group most to be able to outcompete those less groupish cultures. And like in genetic evolution, that differential survival between the groups means that that group which is most successful eventually comes to dominate the entire sphere. As a result, we see the legacy of that competition in today's societies. Today's successful societies contain multitudes of adaptations that lead them to succeed well as a group. Now, there are several ways that one culture can come to triumph over another. The first way is intergroup competition. So one example of that is just through violent conflict, one group violently displacing another one. Another example is through out-surviving the other group. So say one develops a superior agricultural technique which allows them to take advantage of the local natural resources better, and they survive starvation where the other one doesn't. The second major way is through what's called demographic swamping. Our group outbreeds yours, and so we produce more kids with our norms than you produce kids with your norms. Another way is through differential migration. So more people decide to come in and join my group for whatever reason than join your group, and as a result we end up with more people. And finally, there is prestige-based cultural group selection. So if your group sees that my group is doing much better, it may try to copy whatever it is that's making my group so much better. The thing is, it's difficult to figure out exactly what it is that's making my group so successful. So oftentimes, the jealous other group will copy the attractive group wholesale. So consider late 19th century Japan, which, going through its own industrial revolution, looked enviously towards America, which had just completed its industrial revolution. Instead of just copying the specific technologies that gave America its advantage, it copied American culture wholesale, all the way down to the dress. Or consider early 20th century Turkey under Ataturk. Following World War I, it looked around and saw all these successful Western industrialized countries, and so it adopted their dress, their calendar, their script, etc. And this has happened numerous times throughout cultural history. Now, one of the things that's really cool about cultural group selection is that because we are such good cultural creatures, with all sorts of mechanisms that lead us to absorb all the norms surrounding us, cultures can succeed by choosing norms which get people to act for the benefit of the group, even when it's costly to the individual. Consider the challenge of getting men to put themselves at considerable bodily risk, even dying, for the good of the group. From the individual standpoint, this can be a terrible thing to do. But all things being equal, a group that has people who are willing to fight and die for it is going to triumph over another group that doesn't. And thus we saw the values of heroism and valor and bravery and the ideologies that supported martyrdom survive, even when the individuals who best practiced those values often didn't. Now, in our view, one of the reasons why religions look the way they do now is because they serve group functions, compelling their adherents to put the interests of the group in front of their own individual interests. Those religions that were the best vehicles for these group beneficial norms were the ones that best survived being pushed through the sieve of cultural evolution. It's really impossible to fully understand religions without factoring in the crucible of group selection that shaped them. In other words, nothing in religion makes sense except in the light of cultural evolution.